Hello, everyone. Greetings from Finland. It's afternoon here. Thank you for coming to our event. My name is Bonn. I'm a university lecturer in world politics at the University of Helsinki. On behalf of the Helsinki Center for Global Political Economy at the University of Helsinki, and the Finnish Society for Development Research, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the special public lectures and discussions on new books in global development and political economy. We will be having a double header event today and next week. For today, we're having the lecture of Professor Erik Reinert on what the Cold War did to economics, including Ukraine, Russia, and Finland. And next week, same day, Tuesday, same time, 2 o'clock Finnish time, we'll be having the lecture and book discussion of Professor Paul Kamak entitled The Politics of Global Competitiveness. This lecture discussions are also part of my ongoing courses, the Global Political Economy and the Governance of the World Economy and its Future. These are courses that are part of the bachelor's program in politics, media and communication, and the master's program in global politics and communication, especially the global political economy track. We're having the discussion on the topic what the Cold War did to economics, including Ukraine, Russia, and Finland, by Professor Erik Reinert from the Tallinn University of Technology. At the same time, Erik is honorary professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, University College London. Erik is an original thinker, and he is one of the most important authors who have contributed significantly to heterodox development economics. His books include the Myrdal Prize winner, How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor. And he has a forthcoming book entitled Essays in the Theory and History of Uneven Economic Development. Other books you can see in the screen, like The Visionary Realism of German Economics, Thorstein Veblen, Economists for an Age of Crisis, The Origins of Development Economics, and Globalization, Economic Development, and Equality. I remember when I was a student of Erik Reinert 17 years ago in Malaysia, one of the wishes that he said to our class before we were the younger generation at that time was that he would have wished that the Cold War mentality won't anymore be suffered by our generation then, the same mentality that his generation suffered before. But it seems that our current students in the University of Helsinki, especially here in Europe, are still haunted by Cold War mentality and mechanisms at the moment. So we really look forward to this discussion by Professor Erik Reinert. And after this, we will have a comment from our discussant, Professor Heikki Patomäki, who is a professor of world politics and global political economy at the University of Helsinki, and currently also the research director at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. So everyone, I'm very pleased to introduce to you our guest lecturer for today, Professor Erik Reinert.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. Perhaps I should explain why this is kind of became more personal than usual. But I had some experiences in Finland and in other countries that actually I think it's useful in order to explain what was wrong or what is wrong with Cold War economics. So my background is that for 20 years I used to run a business. I went to Harvard Business School, and at Harvard Business School they taught me how economic activities differ. They told me why a shoeshine boy would not make as much money as Bill Gates. So coming with this idea that economic activities are qualitatively different, when you come to Ricardian trade theory, you have a problem. And what I found was that Bonn, perhaps if we start the slides, so you had them there, didn't you?
Or will you do it?
Well, we'll see if you know. I'm saying to Bonn that his professor getting old might be a problem, but I've done this 80 times before and it's always worked. I don't know if does it work now? So if we go to the next slide, when we decided the title, Ukraine was not as fashionable or alarming at the center of world attention as it is now, but I think it's still I mean, what happened in the Ukraine fits the picture, right? Because if we look into the experiences of the former Soviet states, they're incredibly different. And I think looking at that difference can teach us something. So next. Can you do the next one?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing what capitalism, communism, and fascism all had in common, but neoliberalism forgot was the role of industry. These are two stamps that were edited, the left one in West Germany and the right one in communist East Germany for the 200th anniversary of the birth of economist Friedrich List. And I think he was probably the only economist, the only hero that East and West Berlin had in common. You see, they all, indeed, they chose the same portrait of the man. And in the background is his second big idea, in addition to industry, is railways. And you see the East German stamp also mentions the railways. So even fascism, you know, if you go Spain and Italy and Portugal, the latest, they also have this important idea of the role of industry. But this is what neoliberalism forgot, right? So next. And the modern version of Friedrich List we got from Justin Yifulin, World Bank former chief economist. Except for a few oil exporting countries, no countries have ever gotten rich without industrialization first. So the countries that lose their industry grow poorer, and the ones that manage to keep them keep their power. Next. So if we look at the EU ideology before the single market, Friedrich List is still alive. To Cecchini, who wrote the report for 1992, published in 1988, Europe is largely conceived as economies dominated by manufacturing. So the benefits from a single market between 70 and 80% is not that accurate, is seen as a result from increasing returns in manufacturing attained by removing barriers and from larger scale of production. So Cecchini didn't think that countries could become deindustrialized. So if he had thought about that, well, the obvious answer would have been that the countries that kept their manufacturing industries would benefit disproportionately from the single market compared to those who lost them. Greece and Portugal lost almost all this industry. Italy has also been heavily deindustrialized. So I think we see there around the Maastricht Treaty that there's a change in the European ideology. Next one. So the question is, what's wrong with agriculture? There are three things that are wrong. One factor of production is determined by nature, and sooner or later diminishing returns set in. English economists in the 19th century understood this. This was really the basis of Malthusian pessimism. You kind of hit a wall where the land you cultivate gets more and more marginal. There's perfect competition. There's also commodity competition. Technological change tends to lower prices rather than cause higher wages or profits. And a question, why do the most efficient farmers in the world, in the US and the EU, still normally need both subsidies and tariff protection? If you look at 20 years ago, a huge percentage of the EU budget was actually agricultural subsidies. So if the most efficient farmers in the world need protection, that also explains why nobody gets rich based on agriculture. And there is an uncontrollable fluctuation in volume and prices. So I call this a triple curse of agriculture. Next one. So when I did my thesis, I spent many hours sweating in Guayaquil in Ecuador and look at the banana production. In the 1960s, Ecuador got a fantastic advantage because there were diseases on all bananas in Central America. So the Central American supplies kind of disappeared, and Ecuador started growing more bananas. So you see here the area cultivated is almost doubled, but you see that the average yield per hectare is a mirror image, almost a mirror image of the area cultivated. To an agricultural economist, this would not be a surprise. The fact was that the only province in Ecuador which is really suited for bananas is Provincia del Oro. But when they extended, they had to go into marginal land which wasn't that fit for bananas. And then Central America comes back in the supply chain again, and you see the average yield per hectare goes up again, and you can see where the red and the green lines meet. That's you can see they meet to the left and they meet to the right, slightly higher, and that's the difference in productivity increase. From the crossing point to one crossing point to the other is productivity increase, which is completely dwarfed by diminishing returns. Next one. And there are very strong fluctuations in prices. And the problem is different from an industry. Well, if you don't sell cars where you stop producing them. If you are growing something, you can't tell the plants to stop growing. So to the left, there's a price fluctuation in coffee beans, and to the right, there's the price fluctuation in instant coffee, right? So the raw materials producer take this shock in price fluctuations, and sometimes the value of the total crop can be higher when productivity is very low. So a small crop can be more worth than the best crop. Okay? So there's some very strange incentives in there. Next one. And what happened in the Cold War, I think the main thing that happened was that in 1817, David Ricardo had written a theory on economic theory and introduced comparative advantage. And here you see the frequency of comparative advantage from 1817 to about 2005. And you see it only starts being used around the 1920s and 30s. And then in the 1940s, there is an explosion. And that is because Paul Samuelson writes 2 articles on factor price equalization, and based on Ricardo's theory, he can show that there will be with world free trade, there will be a tendency for the prices of the factors, labor and capital, to equalize around the world. And the interesting thing is that you see this grows here with the Cold War. But when the Cold War is won, for some reason, people stop citing comparative advantage. This is engrams, of course. So the interesting thing is that it seems to be some relationship between the demand for economic theory. If you have a demand to show that the market is superior, well, surprisingly, you get a theory saying that. And I think it's fascinating that the frequency goes down after the Cold War has been won. Next one. So if we look at the frequencies of mentioning of English economists, you see the top one is John Stuart Mill. Then it's his father, James Mill, and then David Ricardo is way down there, all through the 19th century. And I find this fascinating. You will be presented for a book later on the history of economics in Finland until 1918. And if you go through there are lots of quotes from John Stuart Mill and even some quotes from James Mill. So it wasn't only in England, it was also in Finland that John Stuart Mill was very popular. So let's move on. Next, please. This is confusing, but it's just to tell you how qualitatively different economic activities are. There used to be 2 types of economics, collecting facts and theory. And this was where collecting facts was important. This is the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US in 1942. And they're looking at 51 different manufacturing industries in the US between 1899 and 1937. So to the left there, you have the automotive industry, where the output goes up by over 200,000%. The number of wage earners there to the left, you see it goes up by 20,000%. And correspondingly, this is an unusual way of showing it, but it's the number of wage earners per unit. So to the left there, you see that the wage earners you need to produce a car go down almost by 90%. Right. And then you have other products, glass and silk and knit goods or whatever. And to the right, you have the losing industries. You have chewing and smoking tobacco. You have gloves and hats and lumber and linen goods, and strangely locomotives, and not so strangely slaves. So if you think that in a pre-globalized economy, all nations had all these industries. So Italy would have a car industry in Turin and a hat industry in Alessandria, not far away. So they would have a winner in productivity on the left, but they would have one of the losers also very near in Alessandria. So it all evened out. But what happened with globalization was that the industries with the highest productivity increase tended to be stuck in the rich countries, and the ones with little productivity increase went to the poor countries to the right. So the best place to study this is really Mexico, because Mexico established what they call the maquila industry, which is the assembly industry. The stuff then that the United States couldn't mechanize was sent to northern Mexico to produce cheaply. And Mexico has two wage strategies, wage statistics. They have one for traditional industry and they have one from maquilas. So you can actually go into Mexican statistics and show how the losers get poor, grow in numbers, and the winners, the car industry gets smaller, and the low wage people actually take over. And this happens also in agriculture, that the stuff that could be mechanized, like maize and wheat, stayed in the United States. And many Mexican farmers who used to, subsistence farmers who used to work with maize, they got unemployed by the subsidized maize being imported to Mexico and killing the local farmers. Whereas things that couldn't be mechanized, strawberries and citrus fruits, they tended to go to Mexico. There was even a whole book called Strawberry Imperialism, which talked about this. And we normally don't think of economic activities in this way, but it is very important. And again, here beet sugar, you see, is very, very high up there. But beet sugar, of course, suffers from the curses of raw materials. So it doesn't. It's very good in terms of output and wage earners, but not in terms of the strength of the wages. So the what I call the curses of agriculture are still around. So let's move to the next one. Here is my attempt at making a quality index of economic activities, just so you know that it exists. That high quality activities, new knowledge with high market value, steep learning curves, high growth in output, rapid technological progress. So you had, for instance, golf balls, which is a high-tech product. The most efficient golf ball producers in the world used to be in Massachusetts, and they made $15 an hour. On the other hand, baseballs for the American sport has not been mechanized. So baseballs used to be made in Haiti, and they paid 50 cents an hour. And if the golf ball producers in Mexico made in Massachusetts made $15 an hour, they would swap $1 for $30, right? So if the Haitians sold their baseballs to the US, it was a very uneven exchange of labor hours, right? So this is a way of actually make the same kind of curve that you saw from 1942, but more with more principles. Could we do the next one? So this is a graph from Carlota Perez, actually showing how activity-specific economic development is. You remember the cars to the left there. Here is the same thing that Carlota Perez, who I think is with us, saw the annual increase in productivity in cotton spinning during the first industrial revolution was very, very steep for a few years, and then it went down again. Right? If you think of electronics, it's Moore's law in economics, in technology, in data, which would give you a similar curve. You know, it's the productivity increase in the 1990s was enormous, and then it was reduced a bit. So this activity specific aspect is important. If you were a big country and you didn't have a car industry in 1950, you stayed poor. Next one, please. No, let's go back two back, please. Yeah. Here you see how that worked in the US. That you have learning. Another way of showing this is learning curves, right? And that's what we used at Harvard Business School a lot. So, so we could see where productivity increases are concentrated. So in 1850, it took 15.5 hours to produce a pair of shoes. 1900, it was down to 1.7, and 1923, 1.1, and then 1936, 0.9. So the law is that, I mean, what follows out of this is that poor countries export when the learning curve is flat, and rich countries export when the learning curve is steep. So the center for the shoe industry was in St. Louis, Missouri, in the US, where they had the Olympics in 1904. And then when it flattens out, it becomes an importable into the US. You know, you can have sports shoes and other shoes which are high quality, but normal plain shoes then get farmed out to poorer country. So the dynamics between learning and where you produce is important. So we may have a blank here, the next one, so don't get confused if we move on. Yeah, so this is per capita growth from using Madison's data, and what we see is that the around 1970s that was the peak of GDP growth, and I put in Greece, Portugal, and Spain before they joined the EU, also to show that they were part of this. And in Africa, you know, productivity, GDP growth rate peaks in the 1970s. And then it goes down in all countries except in China and the East Asian tigers, where you see here the growth goes up. And that may have something to do with timing, that is what Carlotta calls the mass production paradigm hit Europe and created all this productivity, which peaked in 1970, and then that production paradigm was moved to Asia. So it could be the timing of it could be the timing of mass production paradigm, but it's still interesting to see how it moves geographically. Next one, please. So I mentioned the difference between former Soviet countries, which is a very interesting study in itself. You will see to the right there is Belarus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 from the right. You have Poland and Belarus doing very well, all income growth between DC average. But then you come to the left and you see that Ukraine and Serbia and Georgia are generally, most people are poorer than they were during the Cold War. And this has to do with deindustrialization. And there's some very perverse incentives created that if you want to be a democracy, you have to follow the rules of the IMF and the World Bank. But if you are a terrible dictatorship, like Belarus, you can have industrial policy. I've traveled around these countries, and you know, it's not because Lenin is with his raised hand on the square of Minsk that Belarus is doing so well. It's because they actually have a reasonable industrial policy, and that they can do because they don't need the World Bank and the IMF. So my claim is that we have made some pretty perverse incentives for the countries in the former Soviet bloc. We'll get back to this with another graph. So next one, please. Friedrich List, I claim he had three important principles, and they were abandoned. A nation first industrializes and then gradually integrated economically into nations at the same level of development. Symmetrical integration is a win-win situation. UNCTAD called it symmetrical integration. Neoclassical principle, free trade is a goal per se, even before the required stage of industrialization is achieved. Risk of lose-lose and factor price polarization, which I think we're getting. Next one, please. The second principle, the preconditions for wealth, democracy, and political freedom are all the same. A diversified manufacturing sector subject to increasing returns. Neoclassical principle, all economic activities are qualitatively alike. Economic structure does not matter. And I think this is all built into Ricardo. Not John Stuart Mill, but Ricardo. But John Stuart Mill understood List's point that every country needed infant industry protection. And the other modern liberals will never forgive the liberal Mill for saying that, but I think this is something very important that he said, and we should listen to whether we're left or right. Next one, please. If you really go back in economics, which I've done, you find that Chancellor Brunetto Latini, who was an early type of economist, he explains the wealth of cities at common weal. You know, the emperor asked the Chancellor of Florence, "Why is Florence so rich?" And he explains, it is a result of a common weal. It's a synergy, un ben comune. And then you have the neoclassical principle. There's no such thing as society. Margaret Thatcher, 1987. There are no forests, only trees, right? And I think this is a problem if we have this individual methodology. We only see the forests, and wealth is in understanding the trees. I understand that trees actually, in some way, may communicate through the root system. But let's move to the next one. And this was understood way back. Fernando Galliani, who was Naples' ambassador to Paris, said that from manufacturing, you may expect the two greatest ills of humanity, superstition and slavery, to be healed. You know, think of Afghanistan. You know, the Americans tried to build industry they spent a lot of money building industry in Afghanistan, and the only thing they got to work was an ice cream factory, because nobody. I saw the same thing in Zimbabwe. Nobody smuggles ice cream in the tropics, but so that's the last thing that you smuggle. So that's the first thing that was established well in Afghanistan too. Let's move on. And here to the latest stop there. Yeah. Okay. My hands-on experiences with Europe's last colonies. You know, the only two countries in Europe that were colonies in 1900 and stopped being colonies is Ireland and Finland, and they did surprisingly well, both. So for different reasons, but this is a story. I think Carlotta would still agree that, you know, when there's a technological change, latecomers have an advantage. It's like a relay race, right? And the people are not heavily loaded with old industries can get into new industries. I was working with Ira Magaziner in consulting firm Telesis. And Ira Magaziner and myself, we were in Irish Prime Minister Hoy's vision, just the three of us in his office. And he says to us, "I see a new technology out there, information technology." And I thought that we both thought that was remarkable. But Hoy was an accountant by profession. And he said, "We've been 7 years in the European Union, and the only thing we have is heavily indebted farmers and Bailey's cream. That was the only good thing that had come out of it. So we came in there with our learning curves and all the Harvard Business School stuff, and kind of gave some theory to Hoy's vision. And not many years later, Irish real wages reached those of England. And we have to say that Ireland was very much helped by the Irish colony in the US, because every double taxation agreement that the US has with the rest of the world, if the rest of the world gives a tax rebate to an American company, that tax rebate is taken by the US tax authorities. So Ireland became the only country who could lower taxes, and the taxes stayed low. I mean, the United States, because of this Irish lobby, the US state didn't take the tax rebate that had been given by Ireland. So if, that's one of the reasons why Starbucks and a lot of American companies have their tax base there. So this was a clever thing, but Hoy started at Trinity College Dublin a new course in information technology. The first year, all the students left Ireland. The second year, 1 or 2 stayed, but 10 years later, they came back, married and with their children, and was a fantastic labor resource for Ireland. People having worked in Silicon Valley for 8 years or whatever, and coming back and wanted to work in Ireland. So that was a success story. So if you look at the Finnish success story, if we move downwards. So I started a manufacturing firm near Tallinn. And we were producing color cards for the paint industry. And the paint industry in Finland was different from all of the paint industries in Europe. They had the American system. If you went into a paint shop in Norway, you got a color card with, you can choose from 28. You can choose from 28 colors. If you went into a shop in Finland, they had the in-house mixing scheme from America, so you would need a color card for 360 colors. So this was, in my strange little business of color cards, it was a factory in Norway, it was a factory in Italy, and it was a factory in Finland. Finland was an interesting market. So I could see how it worked. There was a fundamental understanding of technology in the national administration. There were still some tariffs left. Finland became tariff-free later than the rest of Europe. So, but they didn't want foreign companies of any kind. So the Finnish government asked my customers if they thought this was a good idea. And they said, yes, we need this in Finland. And it was specifically the permission to produce from the Minister of Industry was, you're not allowed to compete with any existing Finnish firms. So they made sure that we didn't compete with what's already there. And KEDA was an institution that made it possible to set up the factory. And it's still there. We went to visit it. I sold it in 1991, but we went to see it 2 years ago, and it's now 3 times the size it was then. So you got in Ireland, the EU allowed subsidies in Galway in the west, heavily subsidized. In Finland, you were heavily subsidized if you produced north of the polar circle, if you produced on Åland, or if you produced on any island in the rest of Finland to which there was no bridge. So I chose the shortest ferry route in Ireland near Patomäki, about 200 meters, and I built the factory 100 meters from the ferry. And it's there were 30 people living on the island, and now there are probably more. So it's an interesting case study of technology-focused industrial policy. Can we move on? This island is an interesting case. Industrious Catholics from the continent had taken refuge in Ireland, took over a growing share of the European market for woolen textiles. In 1699, the UK prohibited the export of woolen cloth from England because they were competing with Manchester, but Ireland could export linen cloth, right, which is much more labor intensive. So England monopolized what could be mechanized, and the labor intensive stuff the Irish were allowed to work with. A book protesting the commercial restraints on Ireland was anonymously published by the provost of Trinity College in 1779. It became the last book in Great Britain to be publicly burned by the hangman. So it's a famous book for that reason. We get back to commercial restraints when we get to Ukraine. So Finland, very interesting. The feedback from Friedrich List came from both sides. The Russians had read List, and the Swedes had done as well. So let's move on. So I find that in my book on Finnish economics, these two books by Friedrich List translated into Swedish were in the bibliography. So they were read in Finland as well. And Friedrich List's main work, which was published in 1841, a year after this, was translated into Finnish in 1935. Right. So you know, List has been there all the time in Finland. Next one, please. So Sweden was a pretty good place to be a colony. They were enlightened. You know, Finland got a university in Turku, in Åbo, in was it 1640. Estonia got a university in 1632. Norway, we were under Denmark, so we got a university in 1811. Right. So being a colony of an empire like Sweden was interesting. Sweden also had their first central bank. The first central bank in Europe is on the back of this 500 note from the 1670s. So we have to speed up here. So and this is the book I'm referring to, which is a massive book, 800 and some pages. And if I can't claim I've read it, but you know, checking the references, you know, they show the influence of Witte and of List and also John Stuart Mill. Let's move on. So there was very good. I was a head of something called Nordic Innovation Network, so I could compare very well the Schumpeterian studies, and the studies made in Etla in Helsinki were excellent. And it's also interesting how the Finnish Soviet clearing, trade and payment system made it possible for Finland to become high-tech. I had a customer, Dikushpi or Tikurila. They exported high-tech paint to Soviet and were forced to take poor quality Lingonberry jam in return. Right, so it was an unequal exchange wanted by the Russians in a way. And sometimes the paint factory had to repair the Russian railway cars in order to make transport safe for their goods. So next one, please. So briefly, Russia. Peter the Great had a good industrial strategy. He went to Holland and he learned from the Dutch, maximize division of labor, infrastructure, canals, roads, and navy. And he learned this in Holland. Next one. The second was Sergey Witte, who was Minister of Finance under the last two Tsars. He wanted to do the same thing, and he wrote books in Russian about the theories of Friedrich List. And if you asked in Russia what the Bolsheviks had done after the revolution, they would tell you they just took over the strategy of Sergey Witte. And he's also known for having built the Trans-Siberian Railway. So next one. Round 3 is kind of sad. You see here, the index of industrial production from the axis down there should be 1992 to 2001. So you have industrial production being cut to about half, agricultural production being cut to about half, real wages being cut to about half, but miraculously, as the real economy collapses, the exchange rate of the ruble goes up. So that the oligarchs, having made their money in the early 90s buying stuff cheaply, they could get their money out of Russia at an extremely high exchange rate to buy football clubs in England or something like that. I presented this in the conference in Moscow at one point, and the chairman suggested that it should be sent over to the national prosecution, because clearly here was something shady going on. So let's move on. So this is another angle on this. Vladimir Popov, who is a Russian number cruncher, did this. Look at the Ukraine, which has shrunk by almost 2%. Bosnia-Herzegovina, Moldova never virtually had an industry. Georgia, etc. And Russia is not here. But then you have Uzbekistan, which is doing fantastically well. So strangely, if you want an example to show what should a poor country do, Uzbekistan is a pretty good example. They have a mixture of old-fashioned Latin American protection and also high-tech production. You know, they make buses and trucks and whatever. So it is. I mean, you see you see the breadth and experience here. This is in Norwegian. The only thing you probably don't understand is Hviterussland, which is Belarus. So I think this is a wonderful thing to study, and it hasn't been studied very much. Next, please. So I'm claiming that the EU has a kind of colonial policy, and this has to do with Ukraine. The EU puts high tariffs on Argentinian meat, forcing the Argentinians to plow up the pampa in order to grow soybeans to feed the European cows. Right. And another absurd example here is what we experienced in Peru. I've been a lot to Peru, and the milk was very good, but suddenly we come there one year with a baby, and the milk tastes awful, because it's heavily subsidized Dutch milk powdered with very poor quality water from Lima. But I knew that Peru used to be self-sufficient with milk, but the heavily subsidized powdered milk, plus that the World Bank forced Peru to increase the price of petrol, caused the Peruvian milk produced in Arequipa to be poured into the river because it was no longer competitive in Lima. This is what I experienced in 1979, when I wrote my thesis and came to see the absurdities of what was called free trade. Right. Next one. Back to the word commercial restraints. Remember the commercial restraints on Ireland. Here is the commercial restraints on the Ukraine. Ukraine wanted to deal with the EU. The only thing that was important to them was to get visa-free travel into the EU. So they signed a treaty of more than 1,000 pages, which, according to my friends in the Ukrainian parliament, they say 2 or 3 people ever read it, right? But only later they understood what they'd given up. They'd given up the rights to have an industrial policy. That's why Belarus, which previously had lower wages than Ukraine, after about 15, 20 years, suddenly had higher wages than Ukraine, because they were a dictatorship. So they didn't have to follow the rules that the EU wanted you to follow. For instance, they could not export, they wanted to prohibit the export of raw timber because they want to add value, produce wooden furniture. The EU didn't allow that. Ukraine wanted to put an export duty on $60 per ton on scrap iron. Scrap iron converted into oil tubes was an important export product. And the EU is neither competitor nor customer for these products, but still they prohibited it. So Ukraine gets very small export quotas into the EU. The annual export quotas for, say, tomatoes runs out in February, and some nice person from Brussels comes and generously gives them an added quota that will last until the end of March. Right? So it's like the Argentinian meat. In this, Ukraine is, which is such an important agricultural country, is about like Argentina, that it's being the best products they are kept out. So I think if this is why the Ukraine, which was so advanced technologically, became more and more backward, as you saw from these statistics. You know, they used to produce the largest transport aircraft in the world. They were very advanced in mining and a lot of things. And when I spoke in Parliament, I said to my friend, the minister, well, I think you would be better off if you traded with Russia. But of course, I can't say that. And he said, no, you can't say that. Right? And actually, because these economies had been complementary to each other, that trade would have been profitable. But what actually happened was that Ukraine sold stuff to Belarus, and Belarus exported it back. Right? So this is a few facts on the Ukraine, which is not in the newspapers, but I think is still important. The day, you remember, the Americans said that the Russians were going to invade on a Wednesday. Well, the day before, on that Tuesday, I got a mail from my friends in the Ukraine and said, well, can you please participate in a forum on the 15th of April when we have our annual forum? And I said, yes, sure, I can participate. Right? So they were not planning for what happened. But I think this is a useful background on the Ukraine, and it tells you that if the EU would have to treat the Ukraine as the farmers in the Ukraine as they treat the farmers in Germany and France, it would be incredibly expensive because they would have to extend these huge subsidies also into the Ukraine. So there's whatever comes out of this, it will be problematic both for the EU and the Ukraine. Well, I'll leave it there. Yes, okay. Let's get this one. The EU has this program called Smart Specialization. I've contributed to that. So I claim that the opposite, stupid specialization, also exists. Stupid specialization is when Ukraine has to sell wheat to Italy for $200 per ton and buy the spaghetti back for 1,500 dollars or euros a ton. So this becomes part of a colonial system where colonies are supposed to deliver raw materials on. So we don't think of the EU as a colonial power, but to many countries outside, they work like that. And the wheat thing is important. No, I think we'll leave it there. I don't want to take too much of your time. Yeah, well, this is on the financial economy. Okay, if you want to have it, there's a problem here. With it, no, let's go back to the Uncle Scrooge one. Yeah, you see, the problem is that we don't separate. When I started studying St. Gallen, I got this from Schumpeter on the blackboard in the first semester. There's a real economy and there's a financial economy. And when they are in symbiosis, the real economy goes to the financial economy and gets money and builds a factory for 50 years. Right. Next one. But when the financial economy starts to make money on itself, then it becomes like a Pac-Man, that the financial economy is eating up the real economy. And I'm saying this here, you know, Mario Monti and Mario Draghi in Italy, and they pass on the power to finance. You see, they're passing on to Monti, Merkel and Sarkozy. So let's finish with I think I remember that the cartoon from which this comes in Finnish is called Aku Anka, Donald Duck. But if we illustrate what's the mismatch between the real economy and the financial economy with the character from Aku Anka, Scrooge capital is what in religion is called mammon, you know, dead capital, not productively invested. He uses it to swim in. Scrooge buys all the houses in Duckburg, increases the rent, but uses the money for bathing only. Money does not circulate, Duckburg's economy dies. Right? This is, in a sense, what we're seeing, that the financial sector is recycling itself, not going into the real economy. And I put this one up also, what happened. The French used to have, the French has a term, the Fordist wage regime, which I think is a very good term. The Fordist wage regime is if productivity goes up by 4%, wages go up by 4%. And that's how it worked for a long time until unions were, went out of fashion, let's say. So here you see, this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US. So you see, productivity and real wages follow each other. And then in 1975, you see that productivity goes up, and real wages flatten out. So you get what in the 1930s would have been called underconsumption. Right? So this is a very important point here, and we see that now. Perhaps labor will come back. Well, I think there has been a long Cold War between two equally irrelevant theories. Gustav Schmoller, when he became rector of the University of Berlin in 1897, he says, the naive optimism of laissez-faire and the childish and frivolous appeal to revolution, the naive hope of the tyranny of the proletariat would lead to world happiness, increasingly showed their real nature. They were twins of an ahistorical rationalism. And he says, the period from 1870 to 1890 led to the theoretical and practical bankruptcy of both the old schools, which was really wishful thinking, because of course, we all through the 20th century, we had that war. We had the communists against Manchester liberalism, so to say. But living on a happy note, in 1872, 150 years ago, Schmoller founded the Association for Social Policy, which created the basis for the welfare state. So this year, the welfare state celebrates its 150th anniversary. or the theory of the welfare state. So I think this is something we could come back to at one point. And book launch was announced. Well, this is a relaunch of this book, How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor. It's been translated to Russian, to Swedish, to Estonian, to Latvian, around Finland, but not yet into Finnish. But English version is good enough. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prof. Erik Reinert. As always, it's engaging. Now we will proceed to the comment by our discussant, Professor Heikki Patomäki, who's a professor of world politics and global political economy at the University of Helsinki. Currently, he is a research director at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. And he will also have his own book launch on Friday. His book is entitled The Three Fields of Global Political Economy. Yes, Professor Heikki Patomäki, I'll just put you on spotlight now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have some slides as well, so sure. I will share my screen. And these comments are based on two papers that I received beforehand, and they're very closely related to the talk, but they are more general and perhaps also more theoretically oriented. The first paper is The Inequalities That Couldn't Happen, What the Cold War Did to Economics, which was published in the Real World Economics Review in 2020. And I've been also reading and thinking the other paper called Modernizing Russia, Round 3 by Erik Reinert and Kattel, that was published in 2010, on which some of the slides were based. Now, there are a number of agreements between us, but I have also some questions and comments as well. Let me start with at the most general level with the agreements. We both agree, and this was also the concluding point of Erik, that neoclassical and neoliberal economics tends to be exceedingly abstract and too simplistic to be practical guide to human societies. And he, of course, also argued that the Eastern Bloc version of abstract theory, what he calls communist theory, was equally irrelevant. Perhaps we could reformulate this in a slightly different way. If these are used as practical guides, they tend to have negative unintended consequences. And this is exactly the situation that we are finding ourselves in at the moment. I also agree with the general idea or general claim that economic activities are qualitatively different. And they're qualitatively different in a way that matters in terms of their ability to generate economic growth and economic development. This is a very good starting point. Put this in terms of theoretical traditions, we can also say that it is possible to combine Schumpeterian dynamics with Keynesian macroeconomics, which is the basic starting point, of course, within the overall Listian framework. As far as List is concerned and the idea of developmental state, we know from history that this kind of a state has been essential for industrialization, and in some cases also for reindustrialization as well. And in the case of Finland, for instance, I mean the first elements of this kind of developmental state emerged already in the late 19th century. So there has been a systematic project of industrializing this country, and this is something that we see in different parts of the world. All successful cases have been more or less based on that. So there's an agreement to that degree. We also agree that what happened after the end of the Cold War, this shock therapy that included free trade and also other free market measures, led to a massive deindustrialization in the former Soviet bloc, and that those of course include both Russia and Ukraine as well. So these are the agreements. But then I have a few questions, and bear with me as some of these can be a bit more theoretical than the talk itself. A key claim, a key idea behind this notion that countries need to have a solid industrial basis is based on the idea of increasing returns or scale economies. And here's one possible formulation of this, that sometime in the not some formulation, but a claim about the history of ideas, how this came about and how it's connected to the end of the Cold War. That sometime in the 1930s, increasing returns to scale, the very basis for standardized mass production, was thrown out of economic theory because it was not compatible with equilibrium. This has to do with also our attempt to explain and understand why particular ideas emerge and why they prevail in particular contexts. And I think this is a very important question. And from that perspective, I would like to slightly question this idea or this claim, because this problem of increasing returns, scale economies, was also at the heart of the discussions and debates in the late 19th century and early 20th century as well. A case of point being Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics. There were several editions. The first one came out in 1890, and the last, the eighth one, came out in 1920. Marshall died in 1924, and at around, was very soon after his death, Piero Sraffa formulated a very famous critique of Marshall, precisely on the grounds that in typical industries what we have is are increasing returns. Marshall himself was struggling with this issue, and he had to make all kinds of assumptions. I mean, for instance, he differentiated between different time periods, very short, longer period, and also what he called secular time as well. This was very much part of the argument. But then, on the other hand, he had to make further assumptions, including, for instance, that the economies of scale, while they may occur at the level of the industry as a whole, they cannot occur at the level of individual firms, which was obviously a very arbitrary assumption. But he was aware of the problem. I mean, the increasing returns would make it impossible to think in terms of equilibrium in markets that we are competitive. Marshall himself didn't use the term perfect competition, but many later neoclassical economists did. Now, there's also this idea of the imperfect competition, on which Erik, to a certain degree, relies as well. And originally, the theory of imperfect competition was developed from the late 1920s onwards in the 1930s. On the basis of the Sraffa critique. But it still presupposes in its standard neoclassical form the possibility of perfect competition. And I would also claim that many forms of neo-Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics, in fact, rely also on this very concept. And I think this is somewhat problematical for the very idea that the perfect competition is not compatible with increasing returns in industries. In fact, also Keynes's general theory assumed perfect competition, or at least allowed for perfect competition. So his macroeconomic analysis was not based on the notion of imperfect competition, but directly on the notion of perfect competition. I think there are better ways of formulating the ways in which capitalist market economies in fact function. And one possibility is the notion of real competition developed by Anwar Shaikh, which is actually very close to the idea that Schumpeter had about how the capitalist market economy functions through competition that can assume all kinds of different forms, including through innovations. Let's move on to the explanation of these ideas. So the title of this talk and the title of also this article that was published in the Real World Economics Review in 2020 seems to indicate that the abstract synthesis of neoclassical economics was a result of the Cold War. And obviously, if you look at the history of economic theory from the US-centric point of view and focus on the 1940s, early 1950s, there's some plausibility to this claim. Obviously, Cold War considerations played a major role in the mathematization of economics, and Samuelson was very important in putting together this grand synthesis at that time. But there is another explanation, and this we can find in Reinert and Kattel's 2010 paper, where the idea is that there are long periods of economic progress that then tend to lead to the prevalence of these abstract and irrelevant economic theories. So success and affluence, in fact, feed into the process whereby these kinds of theories become dominant. Then, because these are bad theories, once they are allowed to dominate for long periods of time, then finally, because of the influences that are assumed to be poisonous, there will be a disaster of some sort. And then there will be learning, and the more concrete, more the fact-based theories start to emerge or re-emerge. And this dynamic has been going on since the early 19th century. In fact, the Pekka Korpinen's dissertation that was written in Finnish from the early 1980s developed a similar idea, and I actually adopted a modification of that in my book, The Political Economy of Global Security, in 2008. So I think that theory has some plausibility as well. Now the question is, what exactly is the relationship between a particular form of economic theory and the Cold War? If the case is that there's something like an inherent tendency within capitalist market economy for particular kinds of theories to becoming dominant. And one could even use Marxian ideas to explain why this particular form is even necessary for the reproduction of some of these practices and institutions as well. Anyway, this idea that there's a period of unlearning and then learning, and they always follow each other, seems to suggest something like that we are doomed to the eternal return of the same, to make a reference to Friedrich Nietzsche and his famous metaphysics. This is also a question to you, Erik. Now, my final series of comments and questions concern the notion of cosmopolitics that you actually didn't take up in the talk itself, but plays a role in this 2020 article, what the Cold War did to economics. And but it's in the background because the Listian idea that the nations and states in fact matter, and that there's something highly suspicious about these abstract theories that tend also to be cosmopolitan at the same time as well. So it's in the background, even though the concept is not was not mentioned explicitly in this particular talk. So there's an association here between the abstract theories, both of the neoclassical kind and the communist kind. They are associated with what Erik calls cosmopolitics. And they are opposed to the national idea of the German historical school, Sombert and many others. So there is a contrast here, juxtaposition and contrast at the same time. Cosmopolitical versus different nations might be facing very different contexts. The abstract theories are supposed to be cosmopolitical, also in terms of assuming the state away. The neoclassical economics does that straight away in terms of methodological individualism, but alternatively also in the future, which is one typical reading of Marx and his ideas. Now, I would like to suggest that this is slightly misleading. I think that if you look at closely at neoclassical economics, it is in fact based on methodological nationalism. The model of the economy is very abstract, but it's always assumed to be a model of the national economy, even though they don't use the term. Because at first you have a closed system and then you open it up in terms of imports and exports. So there's an external world to this abstract economy. It is, in fact, incapable of seeing the wider worldwide processes of global political economy. And this is a major limitation of its explanatory power, quite independently of other methodological considerations that might be equally devastating from the point of view of whether this kind of a theory can be successful in explaining anything in the world. But this is also a major limitation. And if you look at the alternative, during the Cold War, the Leninist-Stalinist system, it was also extremely state-centric. And at least since the Second World War, it was also nationalistic. The Second World War, from a Soviet Union perspective, was the Great Patriotic War. So it was both state-centric and very nationalistic. The other canon that Erik has been developing as an alternative approach, sees, in their own words, economic development and high wages emanating from a combination of three factors: technological change, increasing returns, and the synergies originating in a large division of labor. I agree. I think this approach is correct. But the thing is that all these factors, in fact, operate on a scale of the world economy as a whole. So the increasing returns are possible because of the world markets. The synergies originating in a large division of labor, they are not only occurring within the state, but the division of labor is worldwide. And technological change is not something that can be separated from the developments in science and technology across the world. But rather there's a very close interaction between the developments one can't even say that they are happening in different parts of the world, because science, for instance, is a universal community. And everything is public, and new ideas are borrowed very quickly and developed further in different parts of the world. So all these are, in fact, part of the dynamics of the world economy as a whole. And this, in fact, raises the question of the governance of the world economy, which is my last point. I would like to suggest that there is another way of going beyond the notion of state competitiveness, meaning neoliberal competitiveness, in terms of developing better global institutions, common institutions. From a global Keynesian Kaleckian perspective, we can argue that the uneven developments that involve cumulative causation, while they can be countered by the logic of the developmental state, they can also be countered by developing global regulations, public investments, and various other institutional mechanisms as well. Moreover, the national states tend to act in a short-sighted way, and they tend to lack vision about the collective future. I mean, collective, I'm making a reference to the world system as a whole. The reason of state, raison d'etat, tends to generate both counterfinality and contradictions of various kinds. And we have different manifestations of this. Classical protectionism is a case, one manifestation of this. So it's fine for one state at the time to resort to protectionism, to the infant industry argument, and so on and so forth. But if particularly many of the core states, resort to a similar kind of a policy, what we have is a development that is reminiscent of what happened between 1870 and 1914, and from 1929 to 1938. So we have to take into account the effects of these kinds of policies at the level of the global political economy and the global security system as a whole. There are other manifestations of the same kind of competition among states, and those involve the neoliberal ideas of tax competition, neoliberal austerity policies, internal devaluation, etc., etc. So there are many different kinds of manifestations of the same same thing. But the problem is that all those involve counterfinality and contradictions at the level of the whole of the system. Building better global institutions is a way of overcoming these kinds of contradictions. And if these institutions are democratic, that can mean different things in different contexts, but nonetheless, if they have significant resources and regulatory capacities, they also make it possible to transform power relations based on the capacity of transnational capital to relocate and operate globally. In this sense, I would argue, cosmopolitics has both the power to contest the politics of abstract economic theories and arguably to take world history beyond the eternal return of the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Heikki Patomäki. As always, it's very thorough and insightful. Now, would you like to respond to the comments, Prof. Erik?
Yeah, perhaps I should do that briefly. No, we seem to be in virtually full agreement. Marshall is indeed interesting because if you read the I thought it was so interesting, so I have all the 8 editions of Marshall in my shelf. So I follow from edition to edition. And the first edition, it's the law of increasing returns with capital letters. And by the time you get to the 7th edition, it's the tendency of diminishing returns with no capital letters. So he was fighting. The problem was that having chosen equilibrium as the basic metaphor, you had a problem. Either you throw out increasing and diminishing returns, or you throw out the metaphor. I think they should have thrown out the metaphor, but instead they managed to they solved the problem by leaving out diminishing returns, increasing and diminishing returns. And it's interesting that Paul Krugman, in an article in 1980 or 81, picks this up. And he says, well, let's assume that we have one country with increasing and one with diminishing returns. And he says, well, then one country will end up exporting labor to the other one. How interesting. and he ends up quoting Lenin. He quotes Lenin on imperialism. And he brings increasing and diminishing returns back into that. But I had a student check, and he never, after 1981, he never puts the increasing and diminishing returns in the same article. If he had done that, he would never have got the Nobel Prize, right? So I think the early Marshall had it right, and he actually suggests taxing increasing returns activities and paying taxing diminishing returns activities, and pay subsidies to increasing returns activities, which subsidizing manufacturing. So I think it's all there, and Marshall it's really the point where you see that it's going starts to go wrong. And I think it's also another aspect here. If you go to Thorstein Veblen, it's vested interests, right? That and you will find that the technological leading country has vested interest in free trade. When it's no longer the leading country, it has a vested interest in protection. So it changes. That happened in Holland. They were the leaders, and England became the leaders, and that started protecting. And all through the 19th century, the English were the free traders, and then when Germany and the United States was catching up, the English invented the imperial Zollverein. They even used the German word for customs union, right? And now we see the same thing with the United States. No longer the leader, Trump comes in and wants to protect, right? But only the US. If he also said, let Africa also needs some protection, I would agree with him. But he doesn't. So I think your comments are very I agree with them, and I think another aspect here is Schumpeter, who at one point says that you have to ask a question, and then you have to go into the theory at a level of abstraction where you're likely to find an answer. And so the problem is that the theory is just too abstract. So and in order to make it less abstract, well, you have to throw out the equilibrium. I think this is the key thing. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Now we're opening the channel for discussion. I see some hands raised. I got some private message here. I think Professor Barry Gills would like to make a comment.
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much. Well, like some of you, last night I watched the live streamed press conference of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I was very happy to see the comments by Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, which I recommend everyone looks up. This is a very powerful speech about what's happening, very clear, very concise, and I believe correct. So what I wanted to say is that the dog that isn't barking here, and I just want to hear some comment, is about the problem of externalities, of entropy, of the biophysical foundations of economics and the biophysical limits of economics, the limitations on industrial modes of organizing civilization and human life in the present era in which we live. And so, I mean, it wasn't mentioned, I don't think, by anyone so far. So I just invite you to do so and your thoughts about it, given that we've just had the mitigation report, and it is incredibly damning. So let's hear some response. Thanks.
Thanks, Larry. Yes, Prof. Erik.
Well, I think there is a reason to be pessimistic. Mr. Soddy, who was a physicist who received the 1921 Nobel Prize in Physics, he was also writing about economics, right? And he saw all the problems. But there is another view, which is from an American economist in the around the 1850s and 60s, saying that in fact we're surrounded by energy. We're surrounded by tidal waves, we're surrounded by wind, we're surrounded by sun, and the only question is how much of this energy shall we let pass by unused, and how much shall we utilize? You know, that is the positive view on it. And I think if we attack it from that side and not from Soddy's side, we can see some long-term benefits. You know, until 18th century England, there was no carbon involved, or very little carbon involved. Right? It was wind and animals, and I think I refuse to take this all gloom and all positive view. But I also don't believe in degrowth. I mean, if we had in the 1870s and 80s, horse manure and dead horses was a problem both in New York and London. So the question is, should we move back to the countryside, or should we invent the car? And then if you say, well, you had to invent the car, well, what car? There was already in the 1860s, there was an electric tram in Berlin. Well, why should we invent an electric car? Or should we invent the steam car? Or then this black horse comes in, Mr. Benz, with his piston engines, right? So I think we are in a situation like that. And we don't really know who is Benz at this point. But you know, the new Benz would solve some problems. He won't solve the problems of gold mining, which is terribly destructive. But he will that kind of invention will solve many things, and I think the only thing to do is to get the different potential benches up in a row and throw money at all of them, right? And some of that will work. So this is my positive view of it, and I think we have not been doing enough, clearly. And the Seven Sisters, the oil companies, have run the world for too long. So.
Just a quick thank you for that.
Sure.
I think we have strong grounds of agreement on the last part of what you said. But let's just say that two things. I mean, Herman Daly had made some interesting contributions to economic theory some decades ago, and also a critique of the false economics that didn't recognize, the actual biophysical foundations and limits of the biosphere and the human capacity to maintain, reasonable expectation of a good life with the existing economic models, the way they were constructed in economics, that is, yeah. Thanks for those comments. I mean, I'm not sure I share the same full technological innovation optimism that you espouse, but it is there. Actually, even Guterres last night said that we need to triple the rate of increase of renewable energy. All public subsidies to fossil fuels must end. All new investment in fossil fuel assets must end. And of course, the UN has been emphasizing for some time now the very great importance of ecological restoration, including in urban areas, and in a revolution in some senses of land use and forestry practices. So it's comprehensive. We're talking about a massive transformation of the way human beings organize their civilization, but to make it in accord with, in a sense, the parameters that are set by the biophysical foundations of economics, or as we should understand them. That's what we're trying to move to later in this century. We don't have very much time, right? Because there's a problem of intersecting, cascading, and amplifying various patterns and processes, tipping points, etc. This is a very great danger. Yeah? So we have very little time for innovation to kick in, very little indeed.
Let me just add one comment. This is also a key issue of future economic theory. I mean, the post-Keynesian and other forms of economic theory has always been saying that unless there's economic growth, there will be unemployment and other problems with all kinds of political consequences. Another problem is to reconcile this with the biophysical conditions of human economy. And this is some, we don't have the proper conceptualization at hand yet. I mean, we have to develop those.
So in a sense, this reminds me, I'm old enough to remember 1972 and limits to growth, right? But there was a book published the next year by a group of academics in Sussex, and the title of that book was Prospects of Doom, right? Because there was too much diminishing returns and limits to growth, and they say, hey, if you pick out what doesn't have diminishing returns, where we can go positive, we can see things positive. So I see that kind of double message going on, but clearly we've been neglecting this stuff too long, so we have to go in very, very heavy. I'm not arguing that. So.
Thanks for those comments. And Anita, are you raising your hand? Anita Keles-Vittanen.
Yes, I am actually. I have two questions, and maybe my first question requires a whole new session. But since you are talking about the climate and the ecological aspects, it seems to me that our imminent concern now is the growing military economy everywhere where the countries are now increasing their military budgets, and nobody cares about the effects of the war and how that also influences the environment and the climate and so on. So any views on the rising military economy and how this actually links to the subject that you talk? And my second point is actually an observation, since I have spent almost half of my life in Asia, that when the professor Reinert mentioned that why Ukraine is doing so badly, and for example, Uzbekistan is doing better. So when I looked at the countries that you had listed, I realized that all those countries, maybe not each a single one, but almost all those countries were actually based in Europe, and the ones who are doing better are actually in Asia. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all those part of the Asian system in a way, and supported by, for example, Asian Development Bank and other institutions. You have any view on that one? Thank you.
Well, I think this list was essentially working on former Soviet bloc, and therefore they had the geographical pattern that came out. But I could mention that the worst case I've ever seen was Mongolia. I was invited to Mongolia in the year 2000, and there they had textile industry. They were fairly industrialized. So and from 1990 to 2000, virtually all industry was gone, and they had to return to herding animals. And because so many people returned to herding animals, you got sustainability problems. But the sustainability problem came from the deindustrialization, right? So yes, but I think here the Marshall Plan is important. After World War I, there was a plan in Versailles. Keynes said, "This is awful. We're going to create a new war again." He left the meeting in protest. He was the representative of the UK Minister of Finance. So then, after World War II, we had learned that lesson, that it was very dangerous to make countries so poor. So then we responded with the Marshall Plan, and while we were at it, we didn't only do that from Norway to Greece, but we also made it all around, to Taiwan and South Korea and Japan. So the Marshall Plan created a kind of a sanitary belt around the communist countries, and the border was between South and North Korea, right? So that was I think the growth in Japan in Asia was also because when this happened, the American advisors were from the 1930s. They understood the problems of the 30s. So this was a very positive period, and they didn't have to these Asian countries like South Korea. They could subsidize business as much as they wanted, like I mentioned in Finland, less, but still importantly. So they could have a negative interest rate of 8 or 10%. So if we can copy what we did with Asia during the Cold War, it will be very important. And also, Mariana Mazzucato talks about missions, right? And the strange thing is that missions, even if sending people to the moon, even the military has some innovation potential. Canned goods was the result of a competition during the Napoleonic Wars of who could get food to produce for the troops to last a long time, and the inventor of canned goods won. It was glass in the beginning, and then it was canned goods, right? And the ballpoint pen was invented by the US Air Force, because fountain pens in jet airplanes were messy, so they invented the ballpoint pen. So the question is, how can we get to these innovations that are byproducts, even of war? They're positive byproducts, right? How can we create these inventions without going through war. And the sad thing is that only when there's war we're allowed to throw so much money after the problem. So this is really sad and really a problem. But I think we have to learn. We have to learn. I think the Soviet Union got a kind of Versailles peace in the 1990s. You know, they got a peace that made them poorer, right? So we had forgotten what went wrong in Versailles in 1918, and we did kind of a similar thing to Russia. So it's I think economic history is incredibly important. But I don't want to sound too optimistic, but I'm just saying that we have been in problems before, and we have thrown enough resources after them. We can solve it. We can solve a lot of things.
Thank you very much. I think just one more question. Alex, you were raising your hand.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to all the commenters so far and the great lecture by Professor Erik Reinert. Nice to see you again, by the way. I'm going to draw us a bit back with the comments on the climate crisis, but with I don't want to share any optimistic or pessimistic view, but what I noted down one particular phrase speaking about diminishing returns. That is, one factor of production is subject to nature, and one of the connections I'm missing in heterodox economic theory is that when technological change is such a key factor of driving increasing returns activities, the essence of technological change is still has many factors of production subject to nature. But what happens in the past, what has happened is just this nature is elsewhere. So we drive technological change based on raw materials that are being extracted elsewhere, probably not in the ideal situations all the time. And this also comes in hand that technological change involves artifacts and processes that are spread around the global economy that also involve diminishing returns activities. So the question is here, how can we push for the drives of increasing returns activities, understanding the importance of strong manufacturing for a good life in general, but while maintaining a global economy that is both sustainable within the planetary boundaries, but also based on the principles of justice in across the different economies around the world?
Well, I think that's an important question, but the problem is that the colonial policy is still continuing, and I blame the World Bank and the IMF heavily on that. But there's some interesting exceptions. Zimbabwe was a country with a nasty dictator, and before then it was a nation that practiced apartheid, right? And because of the apartheid, the country was excluded from world trade. And I've been 4 or 5 times in Zimbabwe, and I've traveled the country up and down. And I saw how incredibly fast manufacturing industry grew under the apartheid regime. You know, at one point, more than 30% of GDP in Zimbabwe was manufacturing industry. And they made sophisticated stuff like plows. You know, they not only clothing and shoes, which they've done since the 30s. So if somebody in Asia, in Africa, asked me, what should we do in order to build manufacturing? A short answer from me is force people with blue eyes to sit in the back of the bus. If you do that, you will be accused of apartheid and you will be boycotted and you can industrialize. And then you say, well, we can assume that the people with blue eyes don't have to take the bus, let them drive a taxi. And this is just to bring across the point that, in fact, apartheid is isolation for a couple of decades is what's needed. And that is really, that is triggering Friedrich List without mentioning him. See my point? And that's, and also South Africa. So that helped in South Africa. So if we can see these crazy things, that helps. If you can see the world from many angles, like Nietzsche said, you know, if to be objective is to have seen the world from as many different angles as possible. And I think if you bring in all these angles, you will see that even apartheid can serve a role. I mean, the point is, I think that's what we're seeing now. Every country should be much more self-sufficient in food production, but also in manufacturing manufacturing. So we should put African countries together in a kind of EU or free trade area only, like the EFTA, European Free Trade Area. So we have to aim at optimal sizes, which will be much more robust under crisis like the one we're in now, and that goes back to relative self-sufficiency, and I think that's the role. That should also include both industry and food. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think time is up. We have very good discussions. Also in the chat, I've actually saved some of them. And the closing statement that Professor Erik Reinert mentioned about seeing the world from as many angles as possible reminded me of the time when Professor Reinert invited me to come over to study with him in Tallinn, Estonia, and to work with him. And he said to me that, Bonn, you come from the third world. You had a stint living in the first world, which was Denmark. Now it's time for you to see and be in the second world. So you will have a view of development from 3 different worlds. So that was one of the encouraging remarks to me by Professor Erik Reinert, and I'm still in this part of the world. Thank you very much again for your for sharing your precious time. I know that you are already in your retirement age. I met you when you were just in your mid-50s. And as Erik mentioned, that he actually came to the academia a bit late because he was a businessman. So he was the one who also told me before that, Bonn, don't believe in economists. If you would like to study and understand capitalism, you have to study and understand the business the business people. And I'm also putting on spotlight now Professor Paul Kamak, who will be our guest lecturer next week, same time, via Zoom, same link. Professor Paul Kamak will be talking about his recent book, also touching on the World Bank and then the OECD and the European Commission. And I know and I believe that he's one of the most important thinkers on the study of international organizations from a classical Marxist perspective. I look forward to having all of you again next week. Again, thank you very much to Professor Heikki Patomäki. As always, thoughtful and insightful and thorough, well prepared. He was able to share his slides for today. Next week, by the way, we'll have, as I mentioned, Professor Paul Kamak, and the discussants will be from Stockholm University, Associate Professor Lisa Delmuth, and Lecturer Gonzalo Pozo Martin. So thank you very much, and see you again, and take good care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks.